OpenStax Psychology 2nd Edition, Chapter 1, Introduction to Psychology. Psychology is a study of the mind and behavior. Here is the sculpture of Eros and Psyche. Psyche was the youngest daughter of a Greek king and queen who was so beautiful that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was jealous. So she sent her son Eros to go down to make Psyche fall in love with some hideous monster. Things didn't go how they were supposed to, and it turned out that Eros fell in love with Psyche himself, and they eventually were married. When Psyche eventually passed away, Eros turned her into the goddess of soul. With all that in mind, you could see how psychology means the scientific study of the mind and behavior. We study everything from thinking, memory, language, consciousness, personality, mental health, interaction between people, you name it, we study it. To understand what psychology is now, it's important to understand the history of psychology. The next few slides are going to cover structuralism, functionalism, the psychoanalytic theory, Gestalt psychology, behaviorism, and humanism. Wilhelm Wundt is considered one of the founders of psychology. He actually had the first lab for psychological research. His focus tended to be on structuralism. When we say structuralism, we're talking about focusing on the structure or the parts. In this case, he was studying the mind, and so he figured the way to understand the parts of the mind was through introspection, or examining your own thoughts and trying to break it down into parts. On the other hand, William James, who was an American psychologist, he looked at psychology more from the position of functionalism. With functionalism, we're looking at how something functions or performs or behaves. So he's looking at how mental activities contributed to our basic survival. A lot of students have difficulty conceptualizing structuralism and functionalism and don't realize that we actually do that to some extent in everyday life. One way to think of it is, imagine that you are in a junkyard. If there is something in front of you that has a steering wheel, an engine that doesn't work, and let's say tires. Now the structuralist would say, yes, there's an engine, there are tires, and there's a steering wheel. Therefore, this is a car. On the other hand, a functionalist would say, well, no, a car is some sort of vehicle that takes you from point A to point B. So from the functionalist's perspective, that piece of junk, since it doesn't run, would not be considered a car. A few years ago in the news, there was a story of a student on Maui who was born biologically male, but she identified as female. In other words, her gender identity, who she thought she was, did not match her biological parts. There was this big controversy as to whether the student should be allowed to use the girls' bathroom. One group would say that no, she had to go into the bathroom that matched her biological parts. The other group said no, she should go into the bathroom that she thought matched who she was in her head. So the structuralists would have been the ones who said you must go into the bathroom that matches your biological parts, because they're looking at the structure or the parts of the body. whereas the functionalists were the ones who said, no, she identifies as female, therefore she should be allowed to use the girls' bathroom. Sigmund Freud is considered the father of modern psychology. While a lot of people might think he is somewhat controversial, what's important to know about Freud is that everything that came after him was either an elaboration of or a reaction to his theories of psychology. Freud's psychology, or the psychoanalytic theory, also sometimes called the psychodynamic theory, basically was the main theory of psychology for several decades. Freud was studying neuroses and hysteria. You need to understand that one thing about Freud is that he was in Austria, and his patients were all upper class Austrian women. Because if you could go see a doctor about things that are making you neurotic, you kind of had to have a lot of money back then. Freud determined that his patients' problems came from their unconscious mind. Now, the unconscious mind to Freud is not what we think of as unconscious, which is basically passed out. Unconscious to Freud is probably closer to what we would think of as subconscious. But in this case, the unconscious mind is essentially the part of your mind that you can't really access directly, but it controls all of your thoughts and actions. One way to access an unconscious mind was through dream analysis, which focused heavily on the therapist's interpretation of the dream. And then another part that the psychoanalytic theory focused on would be your early childhood experiences. Now remember, Freud's entire client base were just upper-class Austrian women. And yet Freud developed this theory that he believed applied to everyone in the world. It didn't matter what gender you were, and it didn't matter what ethnicity you were, or how old you were. So you could be a 17-year-old boy in China, and as far as Freud was concerned, his theories that he created based on these upper-class Austrian women still applied. We will cover Freud considerably more in depth when we get to the personality chapter. Next, in the history of psychology, we have Gestalt psychology, which we will cover more in the sensation and perception chapter. But just as a little basic history lesson on it, Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer were German psychologists who ended up coming to the U.S. In the 1940s to escape Nazi Germany. When we talk about Gestalt, it means the whole, so you're looking at the big picture or the whole piece. And this is the idea, it's based on the idea that your experiences can be broken down into individual parts. And then how those parts relate to each other in the big picture is what we consider perception. Next in the history of psychology is behaviorism. The behaviorists looked at Freud's theory of psychology with the unconscious controlling everything we do even though we can't access it, and they said, no, that's not true. It isn't about what's going on in our minds that we can't control. It's actually all about observable behaviors. Now, Ivan Pavlov is a famous name tied to behaviorism. He is known for coming up with classical conditioning, something we'll talk about in great depth in the learning chapter. And the funniest part is that Pavlov isn't even a psychologist. He was actually just a physiologist who was studying the salivation patterns of canines. And he basically realized that, we know that dogs will drool when they are presented with food. He had a bell that rang, which originally did nothing to the dog. The dog just heard the bell, and it was just a bell. But when the bell came right before the presentation of the food over and over and over again, the dogs eventually learned that the bell signaled that the food was coming, So miraculously, the dogs could drool when the bell was rung, even if food wasn't presented. John Watson is another famous name from behaviorism. He believed, again, that focusing on observable behavior was what was important. And he is known for his studies with little Albert, and I will make sure to post those videos once we get to the learning chapter. Our last famous name from behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. Skinner is a somewhat controversial person, which we will discuss in greater length in the learning chapter. But Skinner basically concentrated on how your behavior is going to be determined by the consequences that follow. So basically, if something you like happens after your behavior, you're probably going to repeat that behavior. Whereas if something you don't like happens after that behavior, you're not likely to repeat that behavior. For example, if you ask a really good question in class and I could somehow give you $100, odds are everyone would want to try to ask good questions in class because they would be motivated by the money as the consequence. So that's something you like, following the behavior, therefore increasing that behavior of asking questions. If someone asked a question and I said, "Oh my goodness, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." Now, I would never actually do that, but we're pretending here. That kind of consequence, which I assume no one would like, would most likely lead to that person and no one else asking questions ever again because they didn't want to be called stupid. Humanism followed behaviorism because humanists said it isn't just about observable behaviors because we are human beings, which make us unique. And therefore, we know that how we behave doesn't always match how we think. As an example, here's a story from, at this point, probably over 20 years ago. My husband's best friend's daughter at the time was 4, and a friend of the family got her a stuffed animal. And so she decided to draw some pictures and created a story about this stuffed animal. Now, her father is in the filmmaking business, so he took photos of the pictures and he had her narrate the story. And she ended up with the opening film for the Student Film Festival 20-something years ago in Hawai'i, Honolulu. Not kidding, that's a true story. And so at this film festival, she's getting brought on stage. She's being interviewed by Kirk Matthews, who was the host that night. And so he asks her questions like, what's your story about? And she's up there going, "It's about friendship." And she starts explaining the story. And her dad was watching her thinking, "Wow, I've just got this amazing kid. Look how she isn't even nervous at all. She's doing great." And then when the interview was finished and he needed to take her back to her seat, he grabbed her hand, which happened to be sopping wet with sweat. The poor kid was terrified out of her mind, but with her father being in the film industry, and actually her mother also in the film industry, she knows show business, and she knows that when you're on a stage, you're supposed to behave in a certain way. So her behavior was of someone quite extroverted and totally enjoying being on stage, when in reality, poor kid was scared out of her mind and wanted to go back to her seat so badly. To this day, she's still not terribly fond of public speaking. Okay, so big name in humanism is Abraham Maslow. He'll come up probably both in the motivation chapter and the personality chapter to some extent. Maslow had his hierarchy of needs, which you may have heard of before. They've had it on shows like CSI and things like that. And basically the way it works is that you have to fulfill things at the bottom of the pyramid before you can fulfill the things higher up. Therefore, you can't meet your security needs before your physiological needs are met. So, physiological is the basis, right? Food, water, shelter, warmth. Once you have that, then you worry about safety and employment issues. After that, you worry about social issues, so family, friendship, love, belongingness. That would be followed by esteem issues, so your sense of self-worth or your accomplishments or your self-confidence. And if you can actually have that met, then you try to become self-actualized, which is basically meaning you have become the person you're supposed to be, at least in that area. And we'll talk about this more in a later chapter. Carl Rogers is another famous name from humanism. He developed client-centered therapy, which is actually really still a big part of clinical psychology and therapy today. Basically, Rogers said that all therapists need to have unconditional positive regard for their client. You have probably heard the term unconditional love, but that would be kind of a more intimate example. With a client-therapist relationship, it's just unconditional positive regard, meaning I only think good things of you. There needs to be a genuineness. We don't want you to think that the therapist is being fake or making fun of you. And the therapist needs to have empathy. Following humanism, we had the cognitive revolution. I'm a cognitive psychologist, so I like the cognitive revolution. Big name here is Noam Chomsky, and he was one of the first psychologists that said we had to really think about how people think, how our brains function, our thought processes for us to fully understand human behavior. Now, here's a slide that is often not included in many introductory psychology textbooks and PowerPoint presentations. It's about Margaret Floy Washburn, and she was the first woman to earn a doctorate in psychology. She obviously was a pioneering woman in the field. These days, most people earning doctorates in psychology actually tend to be women, so there has been a shift over the years. We have finally finished history of psychology, and we're now on to contemporary psychology, or psychology today. There are several branches of psychology, in other words, areas of study in psychology, and we're going to go through a quick explanation of all of these. As we go through the textbook, we will learn more and more about each of these areas. Biopsychology is actually one of the newer areas in psychology, in part because of all of the technology we have now that we can do research that we weren't able to perform decades ago. And basically, biopsychologists, sometimes referred to as psychobiologists, study how the structure and function of the nervous system influence or generate our behavior. Sensation and perception is actually a pretty fun chapter and a pretty fun area of psychology. Some people say it falls under cognitive psychology, others say it's a little closer to biopsychology or psychobiology. Either way, you end up studying sensation, which is when we bring in information through our different sense organs. And then there's perception, which is our brain's interpretation of those sensations. And again, we have an entire chapter on this, and we'll have a lot of fun then. With the picture on the bottom, it's called an optical illusion. And do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? It actually should be able to shift back and forth roughly every 7 seconds. I took quite a few classes in developmental psychology in graduate school, as it was part of my degree requirements. So for all intents and purposes, I can actually also spin myself as a developmental psychologist. This does also happen to be the area that we will study next semester, in spring semester, at Psych240 in the UH system. And developmental psychology basically studies cognitive, physical, and social changes from womb to tomb, so all the way to the end. And one of the big names in developmental psychology is Jean Piaget. Most students love the chapter on personality psychology. They find it a lot of fun because you're trying to learn about why people behave the way that they do. And the field is vast and not everyone agrees on everything, but there still are a lot of great theories like this 5-factor model that says that basically our personalities are broken down into these 5 areas: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And again, we'll study this in depth in later chapters. If you have ever sat somewhere by yourself or with a friend and observed the behaviors between other people, you have actually taken part in social psychology. So social psychology looks at the fact that we don't exist in a bubble. We exist with other people, and so how we interact and relate to those people will affect our behavior. We end up covering areas like prejudice, attraction, interpersonal conflicts, and obedience, to name a few. Health psychology is kind of where psychology kind of starts to merge with medicine to some extent, not completely. You're still a psychologist, but it looks at how biological, psychological, and social factors all come together to affect how you behave, and that's called the biopsychosocial model. Clinical psychology is probably what most people think of when they think of psychology. They don't think of any of the other things we just discussed. And so it focuses on diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders or problematic patterns of behavior. So most people who go into psychology do become clinical psychologists. There are branches of clinical psychology, or I should say sub-branches of clinical psychology, but we'll cover that later on in the book. Three growing areas of psychology are industrial organizational psychology, sports and exercise psychology, and forensic psychology. IO, or industrial organizational psychology, we actually have a chapter, it's chapter 13 of this book, but because we only have so much time, we don't cover IO psychology as part of the course material, only because it's such a new area, it's not expected for intro students to learn it, and we had so many chapters, something had to get dropped. So this is the one that the department decided was something you might read on your own anyway. So IO psychology, you can think of it as basically doing therapy, but instead of doing it on a person, you're doing it on a business or an organization. And I will say that if you want to go into psychology and make money, don't necessarily go into teaching like me. Going into IO psychology is probably the one that will make you rich. Now, sports and exercise psychology could make you rich if you can end up, working with some professional team. But basically, this looks at the different psychological aspects regarding sports and physical performance. Has to do with motivation, performance-related anxiety, and overall mental well-being. So talking about how Simone Biles bowed out of part of the Tokyo Olympics for the 2020 Olympics that happened in 2021, that would fall under sports and exercise psychology. If you've watched an episode of Criminal Minds, you have watched forensic psychology in action, at least the made-for-TV version of it. But basically, it is the branch of psychology dealing with the justice system, and it's trying to take into account an individual's mental state, whether they're competent to stand trial, things for sentencing, should they go to a prison or should they go to some sort of treatment center, and basically also using psychology to possibly even capture the criminals, which is of course the part of Criminal Minds. Now, if you want to have a career in psychology, you will need a graduate degree, either a master's or a PhD, or also possibly a PsyD, PSYD. That also is it's a doctorate in psychology specifically. If you have one of these graduate degrees, you can become a teacher, or in my case, professor of psychology. That'd be teaching at the college level. You could also, of course, teach at the high school level. You could be doing research. You could become a clinical psychologist, who would be someone who diagnoses issues. You could be a counseling psychologist, which doesn't really deal with diagnoses. It's more about people's ability to cope. So when you hear counseling psychologists, think marriage counselor, family therapist, that kind of thing. You could become a social worker. Of course, you can also get a master's in social work. I believe in Hawaii they do prefer the MSW, the Master's in Social Work, if you want to go into social work. And if you're really lucky, there are jobs in corporate and marketing in psychology where you would use your understanding of psychology to perhaps create ads or to try to get people to buy some new product or something to that effect. Looking at where different psychologists are employed, at least back in 2009, you'll see that the largest area is the university setting. So like myself, these are basically people who are professors or researchers in psychology. The next largest group of psychologists would be in the hospital or health service. So they are working with larger institutions to help treat people. You see it breaks down into smaller sections, down to independent practice, also known as private practice, which is actually not that big of a section. It's only 6% of psychologists, according to this chart back in 2009, become private practice psychologists. Now, if you were already interested in psychology, or maybe now I've made you interested in wanting to get a bachelor's in psychology, you're thinking, but I don't want to go to graduate school. Actually, you don't really have to. The funny thing is about getting a bachelor's in psychology is that companies assume you have all these great skills in working with other people and understanding behaviors and things that you don't really learn in great depth until graduate school, but that's okay. You actually would know. If you apply what you've learned, you would know more than the person who hasn't taken those classes. So the number one occupation for people with a bachelor's in psychology is going straight into mid and top level management. So that's pretty darn good. Next one is sales. I'll have a story, I think, in one of the chapters when we start talking about areas of persuasion or persuasion techniques, about how when I was a salesperson during undergrad and grad school, how I sold the most binoculars in the entire company for the sharper image for one particular session. So sales. And then, of course, you see the other job opportunities there. So it's not that you can't get a job using your bachelor's in psychology, it's just that it wouldn't technically be a psychologist or a psychology job. So that ends the official PowerPoint for Chapter 1. I do want to leave you with one last little activity. It's about critical thinking, because if there is any class that you take while you are in college that's going to help inform your ability to think critically, it is a psychology class. So I have a little activity for you. First, pick a number between 2 and 10. So any number between 2 and 10. Now, multiply that number by 9. Okay, you got that new number in your head? Now, add the digits of that product together. In other words, add the numbers in your new number together. So let's say you got the number 17, which is impossible because 17 is a prime number. But if that were the number you had landed on, you would then go 1 plus 7 equals 8, and 8 would be my new number. Got it? So you're adding the digits of that product together. So now that you've got that new number, subtract 5 from that number. I know, I'm sorry, I'm making you do math. All right, now think of the corresponding letter of the alphabet. So if your number was 1, your letter would be A. If your number was 2, your letter would be B. If your number was 26, your letter would be Z. Got it? All right, now think of a country, not city, but country that starts with that letter of the alphabet. And then think of an animal that starts with the following letter of the alphabet. Now, how many of you thought of an elephant in Denmark? Now, am I a mind reader? Now, odds are not everybody got that. And those of you who learned all the tricks for your 9 times tables know how I got there, and that's using critical thinking to figure out how I did this. Whenever you multiply a number by 9, the digits of the product are going to add up to 9. So that was one way when you were doing your times tables to know whether you had the right number or not, right? Because 2 times 9 is 18, 1 plus 8 is 9. 3 times 9 is 27, 2 plus 7 is 9. Get it? So then everyone was on 9, so everyone, when you subtracted 5, had to land at 4, so everybody came up with D. Now, it's very Eurocentric that I said elephant in Denmark. It's possible that for D you thought Dominican Republic, and it's possible for E you thought eel or elk, but elephant tends to be the one we learn when we're little, so elephant in Denmark tends to be what people say. If you want an extra credit point, what you can do is send me a message in Laulima telling me whether you came up with an elephant in Denmark or whether you came up with something else. It doesn't matter whether you got it or not, you'll get the extra credit point, basically because you made it to the end of the first slide presentation. Congratulations.